Hello and welcome back to this training series on FEMA P-1000, Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety. You're watching Module 3, Planning School Emergency Response and Disaster Recovery. Right, so this is the third of 6 training videos that are outlined here. Module 1 was an introduction to FEMA P-1000. Module 2 discussed identifying relevant natural hazards and making school buildings safer. In this module, Module 3, Lori will review planning school emergency response and disaster recovery. Looking ahead, Module 4 will touch on engaging the whole community. Module 5 will discuss the supplemental technical guidance in FEMA P-1000. And lastly, Module 6 will review some funding resources. So with that, Lori, let's get started.
Thank you so much, Gigi. As Gigi mentioned, this module is going to specifically focus on planning school emergency response and disaster recovery. And so during this session, we're going to learn how to develop school emergency response plans and also, importantly, to develop disaster recovery plans. The first section of this module is actually drawn from Chapter 4 of the Safer, Smarter, Stronger guidebook. And this chapter does several things. It presents an overview of the purpose of an emergency operations plan, or an EOP, which is central to school planning efforts. It also describes the recommended process to develop an EOP, provides an overview of the structure and content of an EOP, details the legislative aspects to consider when developing an emergency operations plan, and emphasizes the importance of training and exercises in guiding the reader to make an actionable EOP. The U.S. Department of Education actually developed this really important guide for developing high-quality school emergency operations plans, which was released in 2013. And that guidance actually served in many ways as a foundation for our 2017 publication. And in that 2013 U.S. Department of Education guide, they state that planning should really have 6 key elements. Number 1, it must be supported by leadership. Number 2, it should use assessment to customize plans to the building level. Number 3, a plan should consider all threats and all hazards that a school could reasonably face. Number 4, it should provide for the access and functional needs of the whole school community, including students as well as staff members. Number 5, it should consider all settings and all times. And number 6, should be created and revised through a collaborative process. School emergency operations plans should include the following elements. What actions need to be taken before, during, and after an emergency event? And should an event occur, these actions should be some of the first elements of a plan to be updated when that information is fresh. Consider, for example, that one of the things we learned in our research after the Anchorage, Alaska earthquake was that many of the school teachers, sometimes they were with students for hours after that earthquake disaster occurred in the morning as they were waiting for parents and children to be reunited. And one of the things they said they wish they would have had is pens, ink pens in their bags so that they could mark off attendance and when children were picked up by their parents and so forth. And that wasn't something that was in their emergency operations bag. And so what actions need to be taken before, during, and after an emergency event? And again, this should be updated regularly. Who is responsible for those actions and contingencies for different situations? If only one school staff member knows how to turn off the gas in an emergency, who's going to be the backup in such an event? All relevant staff need to know about and be trained for their emergency roles. And so questions that should be asked in developing the plan include things like, who will be responsible for staffing and managing the shelter should the school be turned into a shelter, and for how long? Will there be alternate locations for the students to resume school while it is being used as a shelter? Or is the shelter space separate enough to meet laws and coexist with students present? There should also be considerations for water, food, medicine, and power for campus shelters in the event of a disaster. There should also be school preparedness and mitigation strategies and activities that are included, as well as safety policies and protocols for diverse people and places. In the end, the end goal is that emergency operations plans should be actionable, they should be easily understood, and they should be readily used. In order to get to that end goal with EOPs, a number of steps are, of course, involved. So how do we get there to that end goal? The EOP needs to be developed by a diverse group of stakeholders. And so this may involve, for example, collaboration with local emergency responders, business and community groups, and other stakeholders. And students and parents should be involved in the development of that EOP, both for their own situational awareness to know that the plan exists, but also because obviously people who are filling diverse roles have diverse perspectives and knowledge that can be contributed to planning. And so any critical gaps will hopefully be addressed in that planning process. The U.S. Department of Education actually recommends that all schools implement the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, as part of the planning process. And what this means is that there needs to be a clear chain of responsibility, because during a disaster is definitely not the time to be asking who is in charge. And so this includes things like including the organizational structure, outlining different roles and responsibilities, and also standard procedures. And so this incident command system actually assists schools in effective coordination within the school and with first responders. And why this chain of command is so important in an actual disaster is so that everybody knows what their role is and who to turn to if they need assistance or a question that needs to be answered. If this feels like a lot, don't worry. There are resources out there to help guide you. And so, for example, you can visit the rems.ed.gov website for this EOP Assist 2.0 tool, which is great. It can help schools both to create as well as to update their emergency operations plans with state-of-the-art guidance. Because as hazards threats evolve and shift, it's really important that the most recent planning guidance is adopted in our nation's schools to keep school children safe. This REMS Technical Assistance Center that I just mentioned includes a wealth of resources that are available to those who may be new to these sorts of roles within their school districts or local emergency management, or for other partners who just want to learn more. And so REMS offers numerous courses on emergency operations plan development, and they are developed at the request of U.S. Department of Education's Readiness in Emergency Management in Schools Technical Assistance Center. And I would really encourage you to go to that REMS website, and especially to visit their YouTube channel, where you can find lists of the various webinars that they have held over the years. And I've linked out to one here in the document related to reunification after a disaster, because we know that reunification planning is oftentimes overlooked in schools. And so they have an hour-long webinar featuring experts on this topic specifically. And so almost any other topic you can imagine, visit the REMS website and you will likely find a resource to help you.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Dr. Paul Myers, and I'm the Director of Research and Development at the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center, also known as the TA Center, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students, or OSHS. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar, Reunification After a Community-Wide Disaster, Planning Tools for Schools.
So again, that's just a brief snippet from a much longer webinar to give you a sense of one of the many topics offered on this website. Additional recommendations for school emergency operations plans include, again, that these be user-friendly. So think of sort of short, clear, and actionable. And they also need to be agreed upon or have buy-in from the different parties that are going to play a role in implementing the emergency operations plan. And so while there are many templates and many guides that are out there, it's important to make sure that the structure works best for your school, your community, your context. And so that's what's great about templates. They give us a starting point, but they also can be adjusted based on the school context and the school's specific needs. This framework here really shows a 6-step process that is at the core of developing, reviewing, approving, and maintaining a school emergency operations plan. And so this is very important. And if it's done in this sort of stepwise process, at the end of the day, schools can really end up with an incredible and actionable document. So I'm going to step you through this just briefly. And so step 1 is to form that collaborative planning team. Even though sometimes some schools are fortunate to have incredible, talented emergency managers at the helm of this effort, it's really important that this shouldn't be developed by just one person in isolation. Instead, it's important to identify core planning team members to form a common framework and approach for the work that's going to follow, to define and assign roles and responsibilities within that planning team to ensure that you end up with a comprehensive end document, and also to determine a regular schedule of meetings. Sometimes when I'm in school district offices, I'm not sure there are any busier people. And so in order to keep this sort of longer term planning in sharp focus, it's really important to set those regular meetings, get them on people's calendars, and to try your best to not let things override that regular meeting time to keep that forward momentum going. Step 2 is to understand the situation. And so this is where the assessment comes in. It's really important to identify the different threats as well as hazards that a school might face. We learned during the recent COVID-19 pandemic that sometimes even schools with great plans for things like active shooter events or natural hazards hadn't planned for a large-scale pandemic that would cause rapid school closures. And so really thinking broadly and comprehensively about those hazards and threats, assessing the risk to the different threats, and then prioritizing the threats and hazards to figure out where actions are most urgently needed, but also to not lose sight of other potential threats. Step 3 involves determining goals and objectives. And so what's the overarching vision or goal for the EOP? But then what are the specific and measurable objectives that are then attached to those goals that can be assessed and monitored over time? Step 4 is the big one. Now it's time to begin actually developing the plan and identifying courses of action. And so this is where starting with a template can really help, so you're not starting with a completely blank slate. But again, as I mentioned earlier, remembering that that template can always be updated and adapted for the specific school context. Step 5 involves plan preparation, review, and approval. So these involve things like, what is the final format of the plan going to be? Who is going to take lead responsibility for writing the different sections of the plan? Who will review the plan to ensure its comprehensiveness and accuracy? Who will approve and share the plan with the broader school community, as well as with local and state level emergency management, local elected officials, and others who have a stake in knowing that schools have a plan in place? Step 6 involves plan implementation and maintenance. So this involves making sure that people know what their role is within the plan and ensuring they're trained, exercising the plan, and reviewing, revising, and maintaining that plan over the time. And I really want to put a bold, bright light on that step 6, because we all know that plans are only as effective as they are in terms of how they are trained up, practiced, and ultimately used in day-to-day life. Plans that sit on a shelf are of no use to anyone because people aren't connected. They don't know what their roles are. They don't understand the different responsibilities and that chain of command in a disaster. And so I just can't emphasize this step 6 enough. And in this training, I'm going to talk about some different ways that the school community can be brought together with a local community to really make that plan actionable and bring it to life. So this just gives you an example, this image on the screen, of the structure of a school EOP. So this is a basic plan. Again, remember, there are lots of templates out there to help you to think about what might go into a plan. What are the different sections and subsections that you might want to include? And so what should the basic plan include? At minimum, a basic plan should say, how is this plan going to get activated? Who is going to assume what responsibilities before, during an actual emergency, and in the aftermath? Who is going to be involved in decision-making processes, and what is that process going to look like? Also, it should outline administrative processes and controls, and should consider diverse groups, settings, and contexts, and explain how the plan will be practiced and maintained over time. It's really important to note that plans should cover all times and locations that could impact school activities. And so, for example, sometimes we know disasters occur right at the beginning of a school day, as happened in the Anchorage earthquake, where some students were already in the school building, some were on buses or in their cars with parents. Others hadn't even set out to school yet. And so what if a disaster happens at that time of day? What if it happens right in the middle of a school day? What if it happens over summer break or during an evening time when school staff aren't in the building? And so thinking about time, thinking about different hazard contexts, also again, thinking about the unique populations who should be considered, and ensuring that different people within the school who may have some responsibility, their roles are clearly identified. So in addition to the core plan, most school EOPs contain detailed annexes that dive in deep in particular areas. And so this again shows an example from a template of a school EOP of the types of functional annexes that may be addressed, as well as the threat or hazard specific annexes that may be included. And so I'm going to give a deeper dive into both of these annexes. And so in terms of functional annexes, these actually describe the critical operational functions and courses of action that could be triggered by a variety of emergency events. What they do is they address the overall response operations in general. And while an EOP could have any number of annexes included, and again, for your school district, it's really important to think about what is most relevant to the uniqueness of your school. But many of the annexes that are particularly relevant to natural hazards include things like communications plans. And so who is going to be responsible for communications in the run-up to a disaster? So let's say that you live in a region where there's a lot of severe weather. Who makes the call on whether school is canceled or students are sent home midday? How is that communicated to parents, caregivers, and the broader community? In the event of an actual disaster, who is going to answer questions from the media? Who is going to coordinate with other public information officers from other sectors of the community, and so forth? So communications, very important. Also, sheltering in place. What happens if there's a disaster or an approaching hazard that requires school children and staff to shelter in place? What is the plan? What about accounting for all persons? So again, I mentioned the case earlier where a disaster happened sort of right at the beginning of the school day, and with staggered school start times, not everybody was in the building when the earthquake that I referenced happened. And so how will people be accounted for? Is it through physical check-ins? Is it through text messages? Is it through phone calls, and so forth? Another functional annex that's really important is related to reunification. What happens if an event happens during the school day? Who will be responsible for handling reunification protocols? Are phone numbers, cell phones, as well as landlines, if available, kept up to date to ensure that parents and caregivers can be contacted? Who assumes that responsibility for contacting them? If a school emergency happens where a school has to be evacuated, is there a reunification location that has been identified within the community, and has that been communicated to parents? Again, an annex will allow the planning team to think all of these different scenarios through and ensure that they're ultimately communicated. Also, continuity of operations and recovery annexes are important, as are health and medical, especially important for thinking about members of the school population that may have particular access and functional needs, medication needs, and other key concerns. In addition to those functional annexes, school EOPs also should include threat or hazard specific annexes. Schools should develop these annexes after really assessing, thinking through carefully, what are the different threats? These may be natural hazards threats. They may be technological hazards, such as related to chemical releases that could happen if a train passes through a community. They could be acts of willful or human-caused violence, or they could be public health threats or emergencies, such as those related to influenza outbreaks. While the FEMA P-1000 guide focuses on natural hazard threats, such as earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, and windstorms, we really want to emphasize that most schools also have specific annexes on many other events, such as active shooter incidents, toxic releases, or many other threats, such as extreme heat or extreme cold, that are really important for the particular context. There are also key legislative considerations that need to be taken into account in developing EOPs. In particular, there are local, state, and federal laws that must be abided by that impact different elements of the emergency planning process. So at this point, I want to pause and say, I hope it's clear why it's so important to have a planning team for developing these comprehensive EOPs, because it is rare to find one person who holds all of this knowledge and expertise alone. But again, when we bring together planning teams who represent different elements of the community, they can really bring in this expertise and make sure that no stone is left unturned, and that schools are in compliance with various laws and regulations, and also that they're meeting their more general goal of keeping children safe. So with that said, it is important that schools abide by laws that regulate their state and community and federal laws in terms of planning. And so there are a number of federal laws we call out in the guidebook that are really important to think through and take into account in creating an emergency operations plan. So these include the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, Title IX, as well as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So again, pausing for a moment and thinking about the incredible stress and pressure that comes in the event of a disaster. And for many people, this is indeed one of their worst days that they've ever experienced as an educator or as a school administrator. And under those conditions of extreme duress, we can imagine instances where certain rules wouldn't be abided by. So, for example, if there was release of confidential information in the quest to try to find and locate people and to reunify families. And so with this kind of pre-planning, the intent is to make sure that these laws are abided by, that everybody in the whole community is accounted for in just and equitable ways, and also that the impacts of disaster are reduced as much as possible. How do we make these plans that otherwise would sit on a shelf come to life? One of the most important ways for doing this is to have regular trainings, drills, and exercises. Not only has research shown that engaging in training drills and exercises can make the planning process more effective so that EOP can be updated and improved, but it also helps to keep protocols relevant. In addition, having these large-scale trainings and exercises is a great way to build awareness within the school as well as in the broader community about response protocols and other activities that are being undertaken at the school. This is also a way to increase the chance that the procedures that are written down in the document will actually be followed in the event of an actual emergency. The Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, or HSEEP, offers support for designing, executing, and importantly, evaluating exercises so that there really can be this learning cycle. If you check out the resources section at the end of the guidebook, you can find more on this particular resource, as well as many other programs and efforts that can support these kinds of activities. There are a number of potential exercises that schools may either be required to undertake at a certain sequence each year, such as drills. And so some states require that, for example, tornado drills are held once a month, or earthquake drills are held once a quarter to ensure that students know what to do in terms of seeking shelter or drop covering and holding on in the event of an earthquake. But there are other exercises that may be engaged in, such as tabletop exercises, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises. And these exercises really are critical to school, community, and national preparedness efforts. One great example of this is the Great Shakeout that occurs in October each year. And it started out sort of as a humble earthquake drill, trying to get people to know what to do in terms of drop covering and holding on in an earthquake disaster. But over the years, it's grown into a major event involving schools across the nation, as well as businesses and other local government and other entities. And millions of people now participate in the Great Shakeout. And so this is just one example of how those drills can actually be tied to larger national or even international efforts to get attention around school preparedness activities. It's really important in thinking about which exercises to pursue to check state and local laws for emergency drill requirements and to make sure that that's built into the regular program and, again, of course, accounted for in the EOP. Why are training and exercises so important? So there are several reasons, and again, assessment of the impact of training and exercises has really shown what an important role these play in education and socialization of emergency planning. So they support familiarity with designated emergency roles, so people know what their role is when they're the backup, when they're the double backup for somebody else. They also help to identify gaps and weaknesses in the planning process, as well as opportunities for improvement and enhancement. They also allow schools to test the feasibility and safety of evacuation routes, as well as secondary routes. They also provide opportunities for students and staff to offer input and questions, and they should always emphasize safety, learning, and improvement. The reason we do exercises and drills isn't because we're perfect or already have all the information. It's so that we can continually learn and grow and, again, socialize this emergency information. So I want to show a brief video taken by chance. A teacher, a middle school teacher in Anchorage, had a camera running in his classroom for a day of student presentations and caught the following on film during that earthquake. And if after watching this, you don't buy into the power of drills and how this can really get into the muscle memory of students, we're going to have to find another video for you, because I think this one's pretty powerful in terms of speaking to the importance of conducting regular drills.
Something that you know is bad, and then Ian finally just shared with us. Landry.
This extraordinary video goes on for several minutes, and I don't know if you could hear that, but the first thing the teacher said was, "Is everybody okay?" And so there's actually several things that I want to point out in this video. One is, again, how quickly the students moved once that shaking happened. It was, again, as if it was sort of in their muscle memory. It was almost instinctual for them to drop, cover, and hold on to get under their desks. As you also saw, the teacher in that classroom was the last one to drop and cover and hold on because he was making sure that all of his students were safe. You also saw that sort of the power blinked in and out, but again, the students and teachers stayed under their desks as the shaking was occurring. And one other thing I want to point out in that video is that even though that shaking was quite intense, you see that nothing fell down in that classroom. Ceiling tiles didn't fall, the projector didn't fall, the screen didn't fall over. And so another thing that we obviously focus on in this guidebook and have been focusing on in this training series is not only how important the drills are and the activities, but also those non-structural and structural mitigation actions with the physical structure surrounding the children to ensure that everybody stays safe in an event like this. And so big kudos for the Anchorage, Alaska schools and all of the work that they put into doing these kinds of drills and exercises, because it obviously did pay off in perhaps life-saving ways in that 2018 earthquake. In terms of carrying out training and exercises, partnerships are key. This is something we've mentioned throughout all of the modules related to this series. When engaging in training activities, it's really important to engage key stakeholders. They need to be integrated into into the various activities, and also they need to be built onto the existing activities. It's really important for school leaders to coordinate with local leaders as well as emergency responders when they're carrying out various drills and exercises, especially those that might involve coordination with local police, fire, emergency management, or other agencies. It's also really important. We know that school days are absolutely packed full. That's why offering teacher in-service workshops or trainings is so important. That image up there on the screen is actually an image of the drill schedule for the Anchorage Public Schools. And so really thinking about getting your head around the different drills for the different hazard types and when those are being conducted across the different schools to ensure compliance and safety for the broader schools. That is a big task. And so that's why, again, ensuring that everybody is on board, understands the big picture, and knows their role in the big picture is vitally important. One of the key messages in this part of the training is about, again, making that plan actionable. How do we do this? Once the EOP is developed, it's really important to communicate it with the community and key stakeholders. So rather than waiting for a parent to reach out to the school district to say, you know what, I heard about this affecting this community, do we have a plan? Instead, school leaders can really be proactive in this regard. Maybe at the beginning of each academic term, sending out that emergency plan, reminding parents and students to update their cell phone numbers and their email addresses so you can get in contact with them, and also to ask them, take a look through the plan. If you have questions or updates that you recommend, let us know. This is a great way to engage the community and to really ensure that they know that plan exists and to have a voice in making sure that it's as useful as possible. One of the things to remember too is that the plan is just that every disaster is unique. And for that reason, it's really important to have as much written out and thought out as possible, but also to know that flexibility and improvisation are so important in the event of a disaster. It's also important to have backup or alternate assignments when designated personnel are not available. And again, driving this point home, the plan needs to be regularly reviewed and updated. And ideally, it won't just be reviewed by reading the print on the page. Instead, it will be reviewed and updated after it's been exercised by the school community and local partners. With that, I'm now going to transition to what I might call part 2 of this particular training, because this part of this training module actually focuses on chapter 5 of the guidebook, which is planning the recovery. And in chapter 5, users will find a great deal of information that we really think is vitally important, because we know it's hard enough to find that time to sit down and to create an emergency operations plan for the event of an actual school emergency. Oftentimes, having schools sit down and really plan out a short and long-term recovery plan can feel like a big ask, but for the schools that have actually engaged in this effort, almost to a person in terms of school leaders that I've spoken with, they've all said it was so worth it because of the relationships built, the knowledge formed, or the knowledge acquired, and just for that feeling of knowing that should the worst case happen, that the school is ready and will get back to its business of educating students as soon as possible. In chapter 5 of the guidebook, there's many different issues that are covered, including an overview of the specific issues that schools may face should a disaster occur in the district or to a specific school, and the steps that school leaders can take to ensure that they recover well. The chapter also includes important aspects to consider while trying to get students and staff back into school buildings. It also includes considerations related to not only the physical recovery of the school building, but also to the health, safety, and well-being of the students and staff during the recovery phase. The chapter also includes guidance on financial recovery and resources that may be available to schools, and emphasizes the importance of looking ahead and planning for the next event. So learning from the last disaster to prepare for the next one. The School Emergency Operations Planning Guide from the U.S. Department of Education that I mentioned earlier identifies the following 4 aspects as fundamental to recovery. So these include academic recovery, so getting students back on track and learning, physical recovery of school infrastructure, fiscal recovery in terms of the financial impact of disaster, and then psychological and emotional recovery. And this portion of the module will touch on all 4 of those elements. How do you plan for recovery? How do you plan for a disaster that has not yet happened? So first is to think about, what do we mean when we refer to recovery? In the disaster literature, generally, recovery is defined as putting a disaster-stricken community or organization back together. And recovery can be much more time-consuming and challenging than anyone expected. Much of my research has focused on long-term recovery in the aftermath of disaster. And sometimes I've heard leaders say things 2 years, 3 years, 7 years after an event that they wish they would have known just how long the recovery was going to take. And they wish they would have taken steps in advance to prepare them for that process. So again, this portion of the guidebook is about taking those lessons learned from communities and schools and trying to apply them. We know that the speed and effectiveness of recovery can be increased by planning ahead. So that's again why we're trying to bring these lessons through this guide. So one of the first steps related to the physical recovery of school buildings has to do with post-disaster building assessment. And this is where having a friendly engineer and architect on your team or in your network is really important. So let's say that an earthquake, a flood, a hurricane, or other event occurs. The first step is going to involve performing an expert assessment of the building or buildings in the district that have been damaged. Local building officials or other trained experts can perform these assessments. And we call out in the guidebook that there are actually 2 products that can be really helpful in terms of conducting these post-disaster assessments. These include ATC 20-1, the Post-Earthquake Safety Evaluation of Buildings Manual, and also ATC 45, which is a field manual for evaluating buildings after windstorms and floods. In terms of these building assessments, it's really important that the damage is documented, because this is necessary to receive appropriate insurance or other reimbursements from the federal government, for example. And these are typically conducted by a licensed engineer. What should happen ideally, and this is why the planning for recovery is so important, is that school leaders should reach out to local building professionals to pre-arrange school building evaluations after a disaster. And so this is sort of, think about this like getting in the queue. A disaster happens, and I can't imagine an engineer with expertise in this area whose phone isn't ringing off the hook as people are trying to get their buildings assessed. And so developing that relationship before a disaster with a building professional can really ensure that they will hopefully prioritize, recognize the importance of schools in the community, and so they can come out and do the necessary building assessments. Again, those local building professionals, they are likely to be very busy after a disaster. Also, sometimes schools are being used as shelters after a disaster. So it's absolutely vital that their safety is assessed. In order to ensure this happens quickly, having that pre-established relationship can make all the difference. After that damage is documented, the building owner becomes responsible for making sure the damage does not get any worse. And so this means, in order to get this documented, once it's documented, only then can the owner proceed with the necessary repairs without waiting on insurance adjusters, for example. One of the things that's really important, a mantra, as well as really a set of guiding principles that have been developed and adopted in the hazards and disaster space, is related to this idea of building back better. So should a disaster occur, what are the steps that can be taken to ensure that in future events that the recovery has involved practices to reduce future disaster risk, have enhanced community recovery, and also have been effectively implemented? The old ways of conceptualizing and doing disaster recovery were oftentimes sort of seen as putting a disaster-stricken community back together as it was before. But in an era of climate change and increasing disaster risks, communities across the nation have been advocating for this new kind of approach to say, we don't just want to put things back to how they were, especially if a school is already 50, 70, 100 years old. This is an opportunity to build back better with more resilient physical assets, thinking about multiple hazards, engaging in disaster risk reduction, education, and so forth. And so really implementing these build back better principles after a disaster are vital, but one of the best ways to be able to implement them, because speed is key in recovery, is to again include these principles in the recovery planning process. With building back better, some of the key things that school leaders can do involve checking with local building code officials on relevant rules. One of the things we mentioned at the outset of this guide that makes schools unique and particularly challenging in terms of encouraging natural hazard safety is that many of our nation's school buildings are actually used for longer stretches of time than other building types in our society. And so think about the school in your community. I think the school in the small town in Kansas where I grew up, I think it's many, many decades old, and it has been built onto over the years, but I think it's probably approaching maybe 80, 90 years old. So that means when the school was constructed, that it wasn't to modern building codes and standards. And so in the recovery planning process, this is again another great relationship that can be built in terms of school leaders, emergency management officials, making relationships with those local building code officials and learning about the state of the art. Also, during recovery, we know that community members as well as officials they may be more willing to support these disaster resilient actions to build back better. And so having those relationships in place before the disaster can really help with mobilizing those networks after a disaster to make the quick decisions that need to be made in a recovery, but also decisions that can have enduring consequences in terms of long-term disaster risk reduction and sustainability. In terms of building back better, the total damage to the school building or across the district affects the timing and funding needed to make buildings usable and secure again. And so there are various compliance triggers that we talk about in the guidebook, including that for severe damage, jurisdictions may require rebuilding updates in compliance with the latest code requirements, for example. In terms of substantial damage and substantial structural damage, this is where there is guidance available from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and there are QR codes as well as links included on the guide that can assist state and local officials in determining the level of damage for buildings in flood hazard areas, for example. And so for more information, please pursue those resources on the slides and in the back of the guidebook. In terms of the recovery plan, adaptability is key. So here it's really important to create contingency plans for the recovery. And so if your entire recovery plan is based on the idea that everybody's going to be able to return to school after the disaster, that may become problematic if the threat you face is wildfire, and if the school is partially or completely damaged in a major event, or even if the school itself wasn't damaged, but if accessibility is cut off in the case of flooding or landslides. And so there always need to be those contingency plans. If the school building itself wasn't accessible, would school go online? Is there a secondary facility that the school could use temporarily while the school building itself is being repaired? And so really thinking through those different scenarios is really important. In order to develop those contingency plans and scenarios, they should be based on pre-event hazard vulnerability evaluations. And contingency plans are so important because they are what can make all the difference in terms of a student's educational continuity. And again, if a student's number one job is to learn, the key goal of school leaders is to get students back into that learning cycle as soon as possible. And so thinking through all these scenarios is really important. And that means having backup facilities as well as online systems to help ensure that continuity. Another key point that we really draw out in the guide is that schools are often used as emergency as well as longer-term recovery shelters. And schools are often designated as shelters due to their unique facility spaces. So as shown in this image on the slide, sometimes schools may be one of the only structures within a community that have large open air spaces like gyms, auditoriums, or cafeterias where people could seek temporary shelter. This is an incredible aspect of schools, but it can also interfere with schools and their plans to resume schools. It's really important in this case to ensure that administrators check to determine how and if schools are included in emergency and recovery plans. And I have to say, after doing a lot of research in hurricane and flood affected communities, I have heard from many school officials that were actually taken either somewhat or completely by surprise when their schools were then used by officials for temporary sheltering, and they felt like they lost authority of their school building. And so that's why having these planning exercises, really working together with multiple partners to ensure there isn't that shock during the stress of the disaster. And again, that everybody knows their role, everybody knows what is happening is really important. And again, contingency plans should be used to consider how to continue instruction in the event that part or all of a school transitions to an emergency shelter in the event of a disaster. And so, for example, a recovery plan may state that should a shelter be open for 1 to 3 weeks, that school would transition to online or would move to another facility, or school start times and end times would be staggered, for example, to accommodate the sheltering needs. In addition to sections on shelters in this section of the guidebook, there are also sections on routine and mental health. In terms of the recovery, it's important to underscore again that this guidebook is not just about the physical recovery of the school building. It's also about the recovery of the people who are within that building. And the health, safety, and well-being of students as well as school staff should really be held as a top priority. It's also important to remember that as study after study after study has taught us, recovery is not a linear or straightforward path for everyone. We know that people have different levels of resources before a disaster, that people are differentially impacted during a disaster, and that of course means that recovery unfolds in radically different ways for different population groups and people. What that means is that resources should be dedicated over the long-term horizon to ensure that students and staff receive the proper support needed to recover fully. I visited Ridgecrest, California after the earthquakes there that happened in 2019. And one of the things that I heard from some school leaders there was that there was this outpouring of support in the immediate aftermath of disaster. And that's oftentimes what we see. But then what happened is sometimes some of the more complicated mental and emotional health concerns, they only started to really reveal themselves in the months and even the years after that earthquake occurred, as the recovery process stretched on and as stress really amplified within families and the community. And so one of the lessons taken away from that was that, yes, it was great to have that emergency provision of mental health support, but there was also a need for that over the longer term. Reestablishing routine is really critical for all of us after a disaster, but especially critical for children. One of the things we know from child development experts is that children need routine. And so this is one of the key drivers for their emotional recovery, but also for their academic recovery. Schools are so important because they provide normalcy and consistency for children themselves, but also for adults and the entire community. One of the things that we learned in our long-term study of Hurricane Katrina in terms of restoring routine was that school staff were constantly working to balance between this idea of meeting the regimented start and end times and class stop and end times and the school routines, but also the desire to be flexible and adaptable to support children's emergent as well as ongoing needs following that disaster. And so really thinking about how do you provide routine, but also flexibility is really important, both for the students, but I also want to underscore that school teachers and other school staff are absolute heroes, that oftentimes not only are they dealing with a disaster at home and their own recovery, they're coming into school every single day and trying to stick with their own routine in the classroom. So this flexibility and adaptability that we've been talking about throughout, not only is it important to apply that to children's lives, but also to the school staff that are so vital to making schools run. To that end, it's really important to keep mental health in sharp focus. Well, we can see the status of a building as it's being recovered. It's much harder to see and to peer inside to know how people are doing in terms of their hearts and minds. And so for that reason, it is important to remember that those impacted by disaster may experience or demonstrate a variety of issues, such as issues with feeling safety, stress, or extended grieving, hopelessness, depression, guilt, and even withdrawal. Sometimes teachers have reported that they see changes in classroom behavior where students who had no behavioral issues before begin acting out. Similarly, sometimes students who are experiencing stress at home, stress in the community, and stress at school may experience decreased academic performance. So immediately after a disaster, again, as well as into that longer term, students, staff, and families may need psychological support. And thankfully, one of the blessings of the many disasters that we have experienced in this nation is that there are now many evidence-based programs and activities that are out there that can help support school children as well as school staff. And one of the resources that we highlight in the guidebook is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which offers many, many wonderful resources for children in schools. Also, at that National Child Traumatic Stress Network, you can find things like psychological first aid for schools and a great kit and field operations guide that school leaders, teachers, and others can use in the classroom as well as out of the classroom. What to do in terms of responding to mental health needs. And this is where planning for that recovery is so important because again, when you're in the midst of the stressful recovery process after a disaster, sometimes it can be really hard to look and find new resources. But in the process of planning for recovery, sometimes those planning committees can actually come together and they can find the resources that are already out there, like the various new and age-appropriate arts or writing-based curriculum that have been developed by various organizations. There are other activities such as peer listening teams that can be formed for both students as well as for school staff to come together. And again, just underscoring this point, teachers and school administrators are oftentimes some of the most generous and giving people you will meet. And as they give so much to their students, it's also important to make space to ensure that the staff have space for their own mental health needs and the requisite support. I'm just going to have one slide on financing the recovery because module 6 in this training series actually focuses much more extensively on various funding outlets. What are the financial records that may be needed for recovery? How can schools ensure that those records are backed up? And also what needs to be done with donation management. And so these are some of the topics that are covered in the guide, but we hope you will watch module 6 for a deeper dive in terms of the financing the recovery. And I know this is important because the times that I have presented in person on this guidebook, oftentimes people will say, okay, we're on board, we want to do this, but how do we find funding for either the mitigation activities that we need to engage in or for longer term recovery? And so again, module 6 will help provide insight in that regard. Next, planning for the next one. So recovery can obviously be so time consuming and all encompassing, but one of the keys of planning for recovery is to ensure that schools and school leaders are embedding this continual learning process so they are ready for that next time, or I may say so that they're ready to share their lessons learned to the next community, the next school district that inevitably finds itself affected by disaster. And so this is why it is so important after the recovery to dedicate time to evaluate the process and the procedures used. What were those so-called lessons learned, and ensuring that the lessons actually are learned. And this is the important point to think about revising plans to improve their overall functionality. And so this may involve things like updating contact information for key leaders, creating new or updated resource lists to ensure that all the information and all the links and the various resources that you've found out about during the recovery process, that they're documented. This is also a good time to make revisions to key response activities in the emergency operations plan, to figure out changes that may be needed to the actual school infrastructure, to the bus routes, as well as to thinking about changes to school policy and procedures. And one thing I'd like to say about this is, on the slide, it says after full recovery, as if there is some kind of magical endpoint when everybody says, okay, we did it, we're done, recovery's over. Instead, I think it's much better to think about this as sort of okay, we're at 6 months. I know we're still in the thick of it, but let's check in. Where are we at? What are we learning? Now we're at 1 year. Now we're at 1.5 years. Now we're at 2 years. And really doing that continual learning, continual check-in, because it's going to strengthen the school community. It's going to give people voice and an opportunity to share both what's working, but also where they have concerns. So hopefully those concerns can be addressed And so again, really thinking about this rather than some kind of magical endpoint, instead of something that needs to be done regularly and continually. And so with that, Gigi, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity today to share on planning the response and planning the recovery. So I'm going to pause now and just ask if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you so much for underscoring why it is so important to plan. Do you have any success stories that you can share where districts planned and it paid off when disaster struck?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to share a story from here in Colorado, but very nearby. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. And in 2013, the state of Colorado was actually affected by a series of devastating floods that affected much of the Front Range here of the Rocky Mountains. And one relatively small community here in Colorado, Lyons, Colorado, was completely inundated. Every major roadway entering and exiting the community was flooded. There was no way in or out. Many of the people had to be airlifted out of Lyons. It was an absolutely devastating disaster for the community. The schools in Lyons, like many of the homes and businesses, sustained damage in those floods. But what made a difference for the Lyons School District is that prior to those floods, just fortuitously, it had happened that they had engaged in some of this training and planning exercises that I talked about during this training. And they had actually done a tabletop exercise focused on wildfire, so a different hazard. But in that exercise, they had gone through the contingency plan of what if our schools are not accessible in the event of a major wildfire. Because they had gone through that exercise and planning, when the floods happened and their schools were not able to be rapidly reopened, they had actually identified a contingency site at a neighboring community about 10 miles away, where they were actually able to reopen the schools very rapidly that fall of 2013, get school children back into the classroom, get teachers back teaching. And it was a real success story of what planning can achieve. And I just want to give a shout out to my former graduate student, Jennifer Tobin, who actually wrote a dissertation on this, because it was one of the few case examples we have of a school really implementing an educational continuity plan. And we hope that that success story of Lyons, Colorado could actually be spread and shared through many other communities.
Thank you for sharing that great story, Lori. I do have one more question. So you spent nearly a decade after Hurricane Katrina studying children's recovery experiences. Will you elaborate on what you learned in that research or in your many other studies of children's recovery regarding the importance of reestablishing routine and how it connects to reopening schools?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I have to say that was routine was perhaps one of the most uttered words that we heard, not only from teachers and school administrators, but also from parents, as well as the children of Katrina, that everybody was seeking that restoration of routine, because the disaster was just so enormous and so devastating. But then, as I mentioned during the training, it was always coupling that routine with flexibility, because the disaster did cause so much damage and destruction and disruption in people's lives, that need for routine constantly needed to be coupled with the need for flexibility. And so what that meant was, for example, many schools in Louisiana have strict school dress code policies. But one of the things that was quickly recognized was many children lost all of their clothes in that disaster, and they didn't have access to the required school uniforms. And so that was a place where, okay, we've got our routine, we've got our rules around this, but we're going to loosen them for this period of time until we can figure out what our new policy is going to look like. And so sometimes these things that just we take for granted during non-disaster time can become such an enormous deal after a disaster for children as well as families. So that's just one example I'd give. And then I want to give a really specific one from the Anchorage earthquake that really stands out to me, is that in some of the school buildings that were damaged in Anchorage, engineers came in, they assessed the buildings and they deemed them safe. But we know that sometimes earthquakes cause things like that, just tiny cracks that will appear in the school walls, right? And one of the things that teachers quickly recognized was that those cracks were very stress inducing to the children who'd been through that earthquake. They felt that dramatic shaking. And then they were coming into a school classroom every day and seeing the minor cracks in the wall that hadn't yet been repaired. And so schools came up with novel things like where they put little color-coded stickers on the cracks to show that it was safe and where they were in the repair process. And so this was a way, again, of keeping the routine, keeping the children in the classroom on time, keeping them focused, but also acknowledging that there was this damage to their school classroom that they wanted to recognize that was there. They wanted to acknowledge the children's fears, but they also wanted them to have sort of an active role in recognizing when the repairs were happening. So I think teachers just do novel things like this all the time. And this is where, again, documenting more of these stories, I think, is so important. And so as people think about that need for planning for the recovery, need to think about how to be flexible and adaptable, even as we're establishing routine, there are lots of really important examples like that of where you can do both. And you can have the routine, but you can also adjust in ways that really acknowledge people's fears, concerns, hopes, and help us to move forward after a disaster.
Great, thank you so much, Lori. So this concludes training module 3, Planning School Emergency Response and Disaster Recovery. In the next module, module 4, Barry will discuss engaging the whole community and how to move forward with school natural hazard safety. We hope to see you there.